Hello, I'm Rahul, and this is HOA Case Lab, sharing real-feeling HOA conflicts, cases, and clever revenge tales. You ever notice how some people think they can turn your property into their personal dumping ground and nothing will happen? That's exactly what happened when my neighbor decided the narrow strip of land beside my fence was the perfect spot for their trash overflow. At first, it looked harmless, just a small bag here, a box there, but within weeks it became a full-blown eyesore that attracted pests, smelled terrible, and made my backyard feel like a neglected alleyway. And the wild part, they acted like it was completely normal. No permission, no apology, just entitlement. Bro, hearing the situation unfold will blow your mind because instead of starting a screaming match or filing endless complaints, something much smarter happened. I decided to respond in a way that didn't break any rules, didn't violate any HOA policies, and didn't even require confrontation. I simply installed stadium-level lighting facing their yard. What happened next turned the entire neighborhood into witnesses of one of the most satisfying cases of silent revenge you will ever hear. And trust me, this didn't just fix the trash problem, it changed everything. Two, when the trash first started appearing along the fence line, it didn't look like a major conflict. It looked like laziness. A bag placed slightly too close to the boundary, a few flattened boxes leaning against wood panels, the kind of thing you assume will disappear in a day or two. That's how these problems usually begin in HOA neighborhoods. Quietly, gradually, almost politely. But what made this different was the consistency. Once the pattern started, it didn't stop. Every few days, more material would appear in the same spot, pressed against the fence like the structure itself was part of their storage system. And the longer it stayed there, the more it blended into their routine. That was the most frustrating part. It wasn't traumatic, it was normalized. Living in an HOA community means there are expectations. Clean yards, proper waste management, clear boundaries. I chose this environment specifically because structure mattered to me. I kept my lawn trimmed, my exterior maintained, and my property aligned with every guideline in the handbook. Not because I enjoy rules for the sake of rules, but because shared communities only work when everyone participates. Equally, that balance started to shift when the neighbor treated the shared boundary as a convenience zone. At first, I tried to interpret the situation generously. Maybe they were reorganizing their space. Maybe it was temporary overflow. People have busy lives. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. So I observed quietly. I made sure not to escalate anything prematurely. That decision alone probably prevented the situation from becoming worse too soon, because once you react emotionally in a neighborhood dispute, it tends to spiral into arguments, resentment, and formal complaints that drag on for months. Three, but observation confirmed a pattern. The trash wasn't random. It appeared regularly, and sometimes late in the evening, sometimes after weekends, and always in the same location. It felt intentional in placement, even if it wasn't openly acknowledged as such. Over time, the accumulation began to affect my yard indirectly. The smell would drift during warm afternoons. Insects gathered near the fence line, and when wind picked up, lightweight debris occasionally crossed over into my side. That's when it stopped being just an eyesore and started becoming a direct impact issue. Bro, that's when it really hits you. You don't think a few bags can change your daily comfort until they do. Suddenly you're thinking about pests, maintenance, and sanitation. And it wasn't just about aesthetics anymore. It was about environment quality. My backyard was supposed to be a space for relaxation. Instead, it started feeling like it bordered a neglected storage zone. I decided the first step had to be documentation, not confrontation. Documentation, I took time-stamped photos over several weeks, and I noted dates and patterns. I kept everything factual, because in HOA environments, evidence speaks louder than emotion. Complaints without proof often get dismissed as neighbor disputes, but documented trends carry weight. That preparation made me feel more in control even before taking any action. After gathering information, I reviewed the community guidelines carefully. Waste storage rules were clearly outlined. Trash was supposed to be secured in proper bins. Debris wasn't allowed to accumulate near boundaries. Nothing in the regulations supported using shared fence lines as overflow areas. The rules were on my side, but I still didn't want to start with enforcement channels. Sometimes direct conflict can create long-term hostility. I wanted a solution that corrected behavior without igniting personal drama. 4. So I tried subtle environmental cues first. I maintained my yard with extra attention, making it visually clear that my side was clean and orderly. I even adjusted landscaping near the fence to improve appearance. The contrast between my space and theirs became noticeable. That wasn't about competition, it was about signaling standards. Sometimes people adjust behavior when they see a clear difference in maintenance levels, but in this case, the trash continued appearing. Then came the moment that changed my strategy. One evening, I noticed a large cluster of items stacked directly against the fence panels. Not scattered, not accidental, stacked. It looked less like temporary placement and more like intentional. Positioning. That visual detail shifted everything. Because when objects are placed deliberately, it suggests awareness. And awareness means the situation isn't ignorance, it's choice. That realization pushed me toward a different kind of solution. Not louder, not aggressive, but visible. I started thinking about light. Trash thrives in shadows. It blends into low visibility. It becomes easier to ignore when evening falls. And in many neighborhoods, problems quietly sit unnoticed after sunset. So instead of arguing, I decided to eliminate the shadow. The idea wasn't immediate. It developed after reviewing property regulations. Outdoor lighting was permitted within reasonable brightness levels as long as it didn't create hazardous glare or violate safety standards. It was allowed. That meant I could enhance visibility on my own property without needing approval from anyone else. Once I confirmed compliance, I researched durable outdoor lighting options. I wanted something reliable, adjustable, and powerful enough to illuminate a wide area. Not for theatrics, for clarity. The goal was to make my yard consistently bright during evening hours so that nothing near the boundary could hide in darkness again. 5. When the equipment arrived, installation was done carefully. The lights were mounted securely on my side of the yard, angled to provide full coverage across my space. I tested different settings until the illumination felt balanced. Bright, but not intrusive. Strong, but not directed aggressively. The positioning ensured my property was well lit while staying within acceptable boundaries. The first evening I activated them fully. The transformation was immediate. My yard looked completely different under consistent lighting. Surfaces became crisp and clear. Landscaping details stood out. Security improved naturally. And along the fence line, everything became fully visible, including the trash. That visibility was the key. For the first time, there was no shadow covering the accumulation, no dim corner where it could blend in. The pile stood out under clean illumination. And honestly, seeing it that clearly was shocking. It wasn't exaggerated in size, but under bright lighting, it looked significantly more noticeable. Sometimes exposure alone changes perception. I didn't send messages. I didn't announce anything. I simply kept the lights on according to schedule each evening. The change was subtle but powerful. My property now appeared enhanced and well maintained. While the boundary area became impossible to ignore visually, that shift created a new dynamic without a single confrontation. Over the next few days, I observed carefully. The trash was still placed there, but something had changed in frequency. The accumulation slowed slightly. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't building at the same pace. And that suggested awareness of increased visibility, and increased visibility often influences behavior more than complaints do. 6 neighbors walking nearby began noticing the lighting as well. My yard looked upgraded, safer, cleaner. The glow added a sense of security during evening hours, from a distance. It appeared intentional and professional rather than reactive. That distinction mattered, because solutions that look thoughtful tend to be received differently than actions that appear emotional. Internally, I felt a shift too. Instead of frustration building daily, I felt proactive. I wasn't waiting for someone else to fix the issue. I wasn't escalating arguments. I had introduced a structural change that operated within rules. That sense of control reduced stress significantly. And as days passed, the boundary line became the most illuminated section of the property. The trash was no longer hidden. It was highlighted naturally by the environment. That pressure, created quietly through compliance and design, began setting the stage for what would happen next. The buildup wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was steady. Visibility had increased, documentation existed, rules were clear, and the neighborhood was starting to see a difference in property presentation. Along that fence line, everything was moving toward a tipping point, even if no one had said a word. Once the stadium-style lights became part of the nightly routine, the atmosphere around the fence line started to shift in subtle but undeniable ways. At first, the trash remained, but it no longer had the comfort of darkness. Every bag, every box, every irregular shape was fully exposed under steady illumination. It didn't look dramatic in daytime, but at night, under bright lighting, it stood out in a way that made the problem impossible to mentally filter out. And that's the thing about visibility. It changes perception. And what once felt like background clutter suddenly became the focal point. 7. The interesting part was that the lighting didn't accuse anyone. It didn't point fingers. It simply existed. It turned my yard into a consistently bright space, which happened to remove the shadows it had previously conceived. The boundary area, that alone created pressure, not emotional pressure, environmental pressure. And in neighborhood dynamics, environmental pressure can be more effective than confrontation. Over the next several evenings, I paid close attention to patterns. The trash no longer appeared in large, obvious piles. Instead, smaller amounts showed up. It felt like a gradual adjustment, as if someone was recalibrating their behavior in response to the new conditions. That change confirmed something important. The problem had never been about inability, it had been about convenience. When shadows offered cover, the behavior continued. When the area was brightly lit, the comfort level decreased. Bro, that realization hits hard. People behave differently depending on visibility. That's not dramatic psychology, it's just reality. When actions are easy to hide, they persist longer. When actions are exposed, accountability rises naturally. However, the escalation didn't stop there. The increased lighting also made the trash situation visible to others passing by. Delivery drivers, neighbors, walking pets, and anyone nearby could clearly see the accumulation along the fence line. And in HOA communities, appearance matters not because of vanity, but because shared spaces reflect collective responsibility. Even if the trash technically sat on their side, the shared boundary made it noticeable from multiple of angles. 8. Soon after the lighting adjustment, I noticed movement in the yard during evening hours. Nothing confrontational, just subtle activity. Items were being shifted further back from the fence. It wasn't a full cleanup, but it looked like repositioning. That detail mattered, because when people start rearranging behavior instead of ignoring it, it means that conditions have changed. The lights continued operating each night without interruption. They weren't flashing, they weren't dramatic. They simply created consistent brightness across my property. From my perspective, everything felt organized and secure. From the outside perspective, the difference between my yard and the adjacent clutter became more noticeable. At this stage, the escalation was psychological rather than physical. There were no arguments, no notes left on doors, no loud exchanges across fences, just environmental contrast. And contrast can be powerful. When one property appears meticulously maintained under strong lighting, and the neighboring area remains messy and exposed, the difference becomes self-evident. Over time, the trash placement became less frequent. It didn't disappear entirely, but the accumulation slowed. That indicated awareness, and awareness often leads to adjustment, especially in regulated communities. The lighting had introduced a new constant factor. Every evening, the boundary area was illuminated clearly. No shadows, no dim corners, no easy hiding spots. I also began noticing that the overall atmosphere of my backyard improved significantly. The lights enhanced visibility for security purposes, which was one of their practical benefits. Even without the trash situation, the upgrade would have been valuable. Nighttime visibility increased. The yard felt safer, and that security improvement had nothing to do with confrontation. It was simply a smart home enhancement. 9. But the most important escalation happened externally. The HOA board eventually conducted their routine inspection cycle. Because the trash was now clearly visible under steady lighting, it could not be overlooked or dismissed as temporary or Hidden documentation from earlier weeks combined with current visibility created a clear pattern. The accumulation near the fence no longer blended into shadows. It stood out as a sanitation issue rather than a private inconvenience. And that's when the pressure shifted from neighbor to neighbor dynamics into formal community oversight. I didn't need to file repeated complaints. The evidence spoke through visibility. The lights had unintentionally made the situation easier for inspectors to evaluate objectively. When something is clearly seen, it's harder to interpret it as a misunderstanding. Bro, that moment is where strategy meets patience. No yelling, no retaliation, just consistency. Meanwhile, the lighting itself remained fully compliant. It didn't point directly into windows, it didn't violate safety standards, it simply illuminated my yard thoroughly. That distinction was crucial, because the strength of the response came from legality and discipline, not aggression. As the days continued, the neighbors' yard activity increased during daylight hours. There were signs of cleanup preparation, movement of containers, shifting of items, and general organization. The trash pile that once leaned heavily against the fence began shrinking gradually. It wasn't sudden, it was responsive, and responsive behavior usually indicates external pressure has worked. The escalation phase wasn't about revenge in the dramatic sense. It was about consequences aligning with visibility. So when actions are exposed consistently, habits tend to adjust, and the stadium lights created a constant reminder that the boundary line could no longer serve as a hidden dumping spot. 10. By the end of this period, the trash accumulation had noticeably reduced. The area still required improvement, but the transformation from shadow-covered clutter to brightly visible space had already changed the dynamic. The escalation had reached its peak without conflict. The environment itself had become the driving force behind the shift. And that set the stage for what would happen next, because once visibility changes behavior, outcomes tend to follow. The real turning point didn't come with a loud confrontation. It came with consequences becoming unavoidable. Once the trash was fully exposed under consistent lighting, the situation stopped being something that could be casually ignored. What had once blended into evening shadows was now plainly visible from multiple angles, including the sidewalk and neighboring properties and in an HOA community. Visibility often triggers action faster than complaints ever could. Within days, formal attention began circling the issue. The board's routine observations, combined with the documented pattern, created enough clarity to classify the accumulation as a sanitation violation, rather than a temporary inconvenience. The lights didn't accuse anyone directly, they simply ensured the conditions were impossible to misinterpret. And that's the subtle power of environmental design. Sometimes the solution doesn't argue, it reveals. And once something is revealed consistently, it becomes difficult to defend. The illuminated fence line made the clutter stand out every evening. There was no darkness to soften it, no shadow to reduce its impact. It was simply there, fully visible, night after night. That steady exposure applied pressure in a way that felt natural, not aggressive. Bro, that's exactly how strategic responses work in real life. You don't escalate noise, you escalate clarity, and clarity forces resolution. 11. As the pressure increased, cleanup activity became more frequent. Items that had sat for weeks were removed, containers were reorganized, the fence line gradually cleared. It wasn't instant, but it was steady. And steady change often indicates that accountability is taking effect. What made this moment satisfying wasn't revenge in a dramatic sense. It was the realization that no rules were broken on my side. The lighting remained compliant. The improvement to my property was legitimate. Yet the outcome still shifted behavior significantly. That balance, legal action producing meaningful results, is what made the climax powerful. By the end of this phase, the trash pile that once dominated the boundary had largely disappeared. The area no longer served as a dumping ground. The lights continued illuminating my yard each evening, but now they highlighted clean landscaping instead of clutter. The environment had transformed without a single argument crossing the fence. And that transformation marked the peak of the entire situation, not because of confrontation, but because the problem had resolved itself under sustained visibility. The lights remained, the standards remained, and the boundary line stayed clean. And that was the moment everything changed. After the cleanup, the difference was immediate and undeniable. The fence line stayed clear. No new piles formed, no bags leaned against the panels. The area that once felt like an ongoing frustration became just another quiet section of the yard. The stadium lights continued to glow each evening, but now they illuminated a well-maintained space instead of highlighting a problem. 12. What surprised me most was how quickly the overall atmosphere improved once visibility and standards were consistent. The yard felt safer. The neighborhood felt calmer. Even the general appearance of the block seemed more polished, because the boundary line no longer disrupted the visual flow between properties. Sometimes a single environmental adjustment can reset behavior without needing confrontation. There was no drama afterward, no ongoing tension, just a return to normalcy, except now the standards were clearly established. The lights stayed up, not as a statement, but as a practical feature. And the trash never returned to that fence line again. Looking back at the entire situation, the most powerful part wasn't the lights themselves, it was the strategy behind them. There was no shouting, no rule breaking, and no emotional escalation, just a calm response that operated fully within community guidelines while changing the conditions that allowed the problem to continue. And honestly, that's what makes this story so satisfying. It proves that you don't need drama to solve a dispute. Sometimes you just need consistency and awareness. Bro, this is exactly how real HOA conflicts get resolved in the smartest way possible. When someone relies on shadows, remove the shadows. When someone depends on convenience, introduce accountability. The stadium lights didn't attack anyone. They simply removed the environment that made neglect easy, and once visibility became constant, behavior adjusted naturally. That's the lesson here. Solutions don't always require confrontation. Sometimes they require design. And when handled properly, even a frustrating neighbor situation can end with improvement instead of escalation. The yard stayed clean, the rules stayed intact, and peace returned to the boundary line. 13. If you enjoyed this HOA revenge style story, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more real-life inspired narration content like this. These kinds of property drama situations happen more often than people think, and every story has a different twist. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts or your own neighborhood experiences, because those stories help shape the next script. And turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. And stay tuned for more satisfying examples of smart, rule-based responses that flip the situation without crossing the line.